Hi and welcome. This is Phil Cheney. He's a fire scientist from Australia. Australia was a pioneer in a lot of different innovative fire ideas, and one of them was the fire shelter. Phil, can you tell us a little bit about how the fire shelter came about and your thoughts on it?
The fire shelter was the brainchild of a guy called Alan King, who was in CSIRO Division of Chemical Research back in the late 50s, early 60s. And Alan demonstrated very clearly that if you had a thin band of aluminium foil around you, you could hold your arm up close to a real hot flame, and 99% of the heat was reflected away from that. So he then designed a tent to reflect radiant heat. And again, there was this idea that it was radiant heat did most of the killing. Alan did his own tests. He tested it himself. He got in with Alan MacArthur and they went to Western Australia and they did a field test. They scraped an area, somewhere about 10 square metres maybe of clear ground, maybe a bit bigger, and they lit a substantial fire in the Jarrah forest in heavy fills. And Alan was in the tent. He wired himself up to measure his body temperatures, his heart rate, and sat there, and the fire burnt past the tent. The experiment was highly successful. Everyone, including MacArthur, were very, very concerned, and Alan described trying to get across the burnt tubing. He almost burnt his soles of his boots off crossing the ground to get to the bare ground. Alan was fine. He measured, he said, my temperature started rising well before the fire got anywhere near us because of anxiety, but the whole thing worked as he predicted. He set about getting manufacture of this tent. It was a simple pup tent where highly shiny aluminium foil was glued to a fiberglass base. It had some straps across the bottom. The instruction was to find a piece of bare ground, or again, a piece of ground that wouldn't burn, set the tent up on it and lie close to the ground. You will avoid the convective heat and you're only exposed to the radiant heat. And we were so convinced by that we went out, and as a research unit who were going out investigating wildfires, we got our survival tents, we packed them with us, we packed them in the car.
What time period is this?
This is 1965, okay. when I travelled extensively looking at wildfires during that fire season. Mm-hmm. And in March, I went out to a large fire called the Tumut River Fire, which is in Kosciuszko National Park. The fire started on the western side and burnt right across the national park into Lake Yucumbene on the eastern side. We studied the fire for some 5 or 6 days, and then a day of extreme danger was forecast on the 6th of March. And so the fire had almost been contained, but not completely. So around about 1 o'clock in the day, it broke away at the base of a steep slope, burnt up on the high plains, burnt across through a mixture of snow gum and mountain gum forest, which is a smooth-barked eucalypt forest, with not a high spotting potential, but a heavy understory underneath it of alpine shrubbery. I crossed the fire, and as part of noting where the perimeter was, I was mapping the fire perimeter at all the points I could get access to. And I got to a point where I thought, I reckon that if I drive 10 kilometres down here and I can get another road that crosses through to another major water storage, I'll be safe there. That's a safe spot. And I should be able to get to a position where I can record the fire crossing the road from a safe spot. Well, I was driving along the road when suddenly the fire beat me to it. Over the halfway mark, but I was hit by spot fire starting to fall around me, and then a flash of a large spot fire burning up to the road. In my mind had thought I saw a wet gully about 50 metres back there. Oh, back there, and at that stage, in our knowledge of fire survival, the exploding petrol tank was still rife. It was popular, and so we left the car on the road. We got down into this wet soak in a shallow creek bank. It had a couple of advantages. It was on the lee side of the road embankment. It was wet, so it wouldn't burn. The road embankment gave us some protection from the prevailing wind, and we sat out the fire there. I was timing this. We got in there. I was timing when the fire hit on my watch. 7 minutes. I decided to go and have a look at the car, and so I popped my head out, and I'll give you a photograph of my colleague Bob Thistlethwaite, who was in the tent alongside me. He was still there. Went out and checked the car, kicked burning material away from the tyres and made sure they were out. The car was okay, but the environment at that stage, there was still a massive blown embers blowing around. It was hot, and I found it better to get back inside the tent and out of the wind, and I sheltered there perhaps for another 15 minutes. I didn't get into much trouble for Alan MacArthur. He said, that was a bit stupid, but all right, very good. Well, at least we know the tents work. Yeah, it's bloody good. And the next summer, I was demonstrating to forestry students, saying, this is a survival tent, this is what you should have if you're out firefighting. You clear a small patch of ground, get in it, and you'll survive the fire because you'll be protected from the radiant heat. So we lit the fire, it burnt up to the tent, and all of a sudden the tent got up and fortunately walked out of the fire. He threw the tent off, and he had burnt on the arms, face, and anywhere there were exposed skins. Had second-degree burns. Rushed him off to the hospital, visited him later with a couple of cases of beer, and he said, yeah, that's all right, Phil. Don't think I'd get away with that today, but things were different back then. Anyway, we said, well, bloody, why did this tent burn? I got another tent out, and I then tested it myself by setting myself up close to the fire, and it did the job okay. We sent the burnt tent back to Melbourne. They found out that the resin which glued the fiberglass to the aluminium was flammable, and it was the resin burning inside the tent that burnt the student. So the manufacturer said, bloody hell, and it was explained to him that, look, the prescription for the tent said that it had to be unwashed fiberglass and this particular glue to be used. The tent had used a batch of washed fiberglass, and the detergent left over from the washing reacted with the glue and made it flammable.
Oh.
At that point, the manufacturer said, "Bugger this. I can't guarantee that I'm going to get unwashed fiberglass when I order it, because washing the fiberglass is a standard industrial procedure." So he immediately ceased his production of the tent. I then went back and looked at the circumstances with a somewhat more critical eye and had a look. I found that the fire where I sheltered wasn't as severe as the impression it had given me when I burnt over. It wasn't a full-scale crown fire, so it was somewhat less intensity that I could have faced on that road if I'd been in a different position. I also found that that was the only safe place that wouldn't burn on the side of the road in 7.5 kilometres where the fire front crossed it. So I then came to the conclusion that the fact that I had the tent caused me to take an unacceptable risk in crossing the head of a fire under extreme fire danger conditions when the fire was moving at around about 6 or 7 kilometres an hour. And so I then looked at a number of fatalities in America and fire tent deployments. And I decided in a lot of those cases the training was inadequate, the deployment, there were problems with the deployment. In one case that was touted as being a great saviour for the fire tents, the Forest Service had cleared a large area, safety area of forest, and they'd piled it all up, and the people who got in their fire tents and the firefighters went to the furthest most point away from the fire. Unfortunately, that happened to be quite close to the windrow of pushed timber that had stacked up when they did the clearing. So the first fire came over and they thought they were right. Then the windrow caught alight and they had to scurry back from that to get to another spot, and then the windrow against them caught alight, and they said, "Oh no, here's a problem." Then I looked at finding a safe area. How long? We said, you can just scrape an area with a rake hoe, because Australian leaf litter is pretty loose, it rakes easily. But we measured then how fast people could rake. And we said, okay, let's be sensible. Let's say we need a 10 by 10 metre square to get into, big area. How long is it going to take to rake that and disperse the litter so it's not a great pile on one side of them? Our firefighters, who are pretty fit, when they're working that hard, could only scrape at a rate of around about 1 to 1.5 square metres per minute. So I'm asking them to build an area that's going to take them 90 minutes to build. Now that's impractical. You can't do that. So then, where are you going to find a safe area? And the conclusion that I came to, there are very few locations for people where the safe area is anything other than on the burnt area behind the fire. And if you plan your suppression properly from an anchor point, you should be able to retire back to that point. And at that point, a fire tent is unnecessary. And as I've explained in another show, the dead man zone put in closer focus the problems of getting from the fire line back to a safe area when there's a sudden change of wind and the behaviour of the fire after that sudden change. But at that stage we said, look, Australia really doesn't need a fire tent for its firefighters. We are not going to put them in a position, or we shouldn't put them in a position, where the fire boss leading the fire assesses that they don't have the ability to access a fire if there's some escalation of the fire. Quite a lot of this is to do when they fight the fire. What's the weather conditions? If you're working at night, then the chances of escalation are pretty low. Otherwise, you know, the fire boss has to know what the troops are doing, because the troops are usually working too hard to think about their own safety. That responsibility becomes to the team leader, the fire boss, and he should not be doing hard physical work if he's going to give his crew sound advice on what the fire's doing. That's his job. There is occasional cases where a fire tent would help. Again, some cases in the States where firefighters have opted to go on an area that they thought was safe, like a scree slope, but didn't realise the scree slope was full of needles underneath it and would still burn, and didn't take an option which was much safer, which was the sandy riverbank or the water itself. There has been this myth brought about that hot water is not safe to get into, and that's true. But on a day when a fire is approaching you and you have a cattle trough and it's a 31-degree day, the temperature of the cattle trough is not going to exceed something like 25 degrees, and you only have to be in it for the period of the fire passing over you, and in grasslands you can burn on under burnt ground. There was a case in Como Janelli, it's a suburb of southern Sydney, where a house, they opened the door just as to flee the house, just as the fire roared up the slope. The flames came straight up the slope, in through the garage door, and set the house alight immediately. A woman was killed pretty much instantaneously. The husband and the kids got into the swimming pool, which was on the lee side of the house. They sat in the swimming pool with towels over their head and keep wetting them. And they were in the pool for over an hour, and that house burnt down over the top of them. And they survived that situation because they created a little pocket of air in the water by themselves. So they don't recommend that to people to do. But water is an area that won't burn. Think about it. Think about where the wind is coming from. Where is the convective air coming from? Is that going to affect you? There is no point in seeking an area on top of a boulder if it's upslope of a fire coming up underneath you, and you're going to be hit by the convective gases, because that will kill you faster than the radiant heat. It really will. Certainly there are situations where you've got a nice wide rocky shelf where putting a fire tent on it would give you some extra assistance in surviving. You could probably survive without it, but it would help. But you have to go through all the other processes. That's not the thing you rely on. The thing you rely on is finding an area that won't burn. I can't stress that strongly enough, no matter what you're in. If you're in your home, if you're in a car, on the road, if you're going somewhere and you are threatened by fire, you must find an area that won't burn, or if there are no other options, can you find a grassy paddock that will burn out quickly? And you're in a car and you can survive that. I think in terms of survival tents, I think now they have become cumbersome from what I've read. I don't have any recent experience with them at all. I've given up putting myself in that sort of risky position for some years now. Because hot air would kill me much faster now than it would back then.
We're doing this for all of you. If you like what we're doing, please give us a thumbs up, hit the subscribe button, and leave a comment below. See you next time.